Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Williamson Jr., professor of religious studies at Hendrix College and co-host of the Bible Worm podcast. I'm also the author of this little book, The Forgotten Books of the Bible, and this is one part of a series of discussions of that book that you could use just for your own interest, or you could use it as a Sunday school class or as a lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. This is the first of two lectures on Ecclesiastes. This one is going to be a little depressing. We're going to be talking about Ecclesiastes' view that everything is mere breath, everything is transient. Next time, we'll talk a little more about Kohelet, Ecclesiastes' positive view of how people might be able to live in a world where everything is transient. So that's where we are. I'm glad you're here. Hope you enjoy it. So to start with Ecclesiastes, the Hebrew name of the book is Kohelet. That's also the name of the speaker in the book who starts talking in chapter 1, verse 2. The word Kohelet in Hebrew comes from the Hebrew root kahal, which means to gather. So sometimes you'll see Kohelet translated in different translations as the preacher. The preacher is just a reference to gathering congregants or gathering worshipers. So it's preserving that idea of gathering, but it's saying what he's gathering is worship attendees. This is actually where the word Ecclesiastes comes from. The early word for the church in Greek was ekklesia, and so Ecclesiastes, the one who gathers people to worship. Sometimes you will see Kohelet translated as the teacher. That idea is that Kohelet is gathering pupils, gathering teachers to himself and teaching them. He's like a college professor, so to speak. When I write about Kohelet in my book, I call him the gatherer. One of the reasons is because my editor said no one can pronounce Kohelet, and so you need to call him something else, which I think she turns out to have been right about that. But the other reason that I like to call him the gatherer is because it preserves the ambiguity about exactly what that name or title means. The gatherer does gather people to himself. They might be in a context of worship. They more likely are in a context of teaching. We get gathered to him as readers of the book, and he kind of holds an audience with us while we think about what he is trying to tell us. He also gathers observations. He gathers wisdom from his past. He gathers questions about the world. So the gatherer is how I refer to him in the book. So the first words of the gatherer come in 1-2. The traditional translation, vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So that word there, vanity, it doesn't mean vanity like you're stuck on yourself or you look in the mirror all the time or you think this song is about you, don't you? This vanity means something more like pointless or without any purpose. So the Common English Bible, which I use in my book, their translation is perfectly pointless. Perfectly pointless. Everything is pointless. The Hebrew word that underlies this English translation is the word hevel, which very literally means a breath or a vapor. So in Hebrew, havel havalim, the most vaporous thing, is what Kohelet is saying. So it's worth thinking a little bit about what does that image of everything is vapor or everything is breath even mean. One of the ways that I think about it is if you go outside on a cool autumn evening or in the dead of the winter and you breathe out, then there's this vapor, that appears before your mouth. And it's there. You can see it. You can look at it. But almost as soon as it appears, it disappears. So there's something there about transience. There's also something there about if you try to grab that vapor, you can't touch it. You can't manipulate it. You can't put it in your pocket and save it for tomorrow. So there's something there about the appearance of this reality, but over which we have no control. We have no ability to interact with it or to engage it in any kind of way. So it's an interesting metaphor, and it's worth thinking a little bit about just in your own mind or in your study group or whatever it might be, about what do you think he means, and we'll see more as we go on in the book. Now the question that orients Ecclesiastes, at least at the beginning, comes in chapter 1, verse 3. I think of this as kind of the orienting question to the thesis statement, which came in 1-2. So he gives you the answer to the question before he gives you the question. But the question is this: what do people gain from all the work that they work so hard at under the sun? The Hebrew word for gain there is a word borrowed from Persian economic language, yitron. It literally means profit. So what I think is happening here is Kohelet is thinking about his life as a fiscal year of a business. And so he's balancing the books. He's thinking about like, okay, at the end of my life, when I'm on my deathbed, when it's time to balance the books, and I look at what I've taken in my life, and I look at what I've produced in my life, what's left over? So the question, as we might ask it more commonly, is what has my life added up to? What is the cumulative effect of my life that is greater than the expense of my life? He's already given us the answer in 1:2. Everything is a breath. Everything adds up to nothing. The accumulation of your life's work is vapor. It disappears as soon as you die. Great, right? Uplifting book. Now, what do you hang with me though? Because I think if we give Ecclesiastes this kind of depressing view, rather than depressing, it might just be sort of realistic, and so it kind of orients us to thinking about some things that we might not otherwise want to think about. Now, in chapter 2, the speaker Kohelet imagines himself to be King Solomon, and so he thinks about if just your average person, if their life doesn't amount to anything, well, what about if I were a king? And so he thinks of himself as the greatest king of Israel, the greatest, wisest, richest king who ever lived. And so in chapter 2, he says, I took on great projects. I built houses. I planted vineyards. I made gardens. I planted trees. I made reservoirs. I acquired servants, and male and female. I had slaves, herds of cattle, sheep. I was richer than anyone before me. I had silver and gold, treasures of kings and provinces, male and female singers, and so on and so forth. Treasure chest galore. He is the richest, wisest, most substantial person who has ever lived in Israel. And then the question is, so what has it added up to? So in verse 11, he says, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had worked so hard to achieve, I realized that it was pointless. That is that word hevel. It was vapor, a chasing after the wind. Nothing is to be gained under the sun. That is that word profit. There is no profit under the sun. There is no profit in life. No matter how wise you are, no matter what you accumulate, no matter how substantial a person you are, there is nothing left over at the end of life that is to be considered a profit or a gain. Now, the reason Kohelet thinks that is, he works this out in different ways in the book, but a kind of a nice way of getting at it is chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. He says, there is no eternal memory of the wise any more than the foolish, because everyone is forgotten before long. And then he asks, how can the wise die just like the fool? Now, what he's working with here is this idea that he's gotten from Proverbs, his sort of traditional wisdom, which says if you are wise, if you are righteous, your memory will go on after you. You'll be a blessing to future generations. You'll hand on money, inheritance to the people who come after you. You'll have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will carry on your legacy. But the problem is, even if that were true, no one would remember that you had ever existed. There's this frailty of human memory. And whether you're righteous and you do all the right things, or whether you're a fool and you just live your life kind of haphazardly, in either case, in a couple of generations, he thinks, you're going to be forgotten. I try to play with this idea in my own life, and I think back in my own genealogy, like, I'm the one responsible for preserving the memory of people who came before me, and I think I could get maybe 4 generations back among men on my father's side, so a very limited number of the people in my family tree. I could get there before, I just don't know who came before them. And so it really is true, for at least from one way of thinking, that no matter how you live your life, you'll be forgotten. So Ecclesiastes, Kohelet then says, the gatherer says, so I hated life. Like, I don't know how to live like that. If the world is going to go on as though I never lived, like, why am I even here? That's his question. Where do I find meaning? Where do I find value? Where do I find profit in life? The gatherer doubles down in chapter 3. He says, so right now he's said the wise and the foolish are the same. And now he says, God tests humans to show them that they are but animals. So not only is there no difference in a righteous and a wicked or a wise and foolish person, but there's no difference in you and like a squirrel, is what he's saying, right? Human beings share the same fate. One dies just like the other. We die, squirrels die. Both have the same life breath. But there's nothing that distinguishes us. Humans are no better off because everything is vapor. Everything is pointless. And then he takes us back to Genesis chapter 3, I think, and says, all go to the same place. All are from the dust. All return to the dust. We die, righteous die, wicked die, wise die, fool die, squirrels die. It's all the same. Now, in verse 21, he gives some indication that maybe he has heard about the possibility of a life after death. He says, who knows if a human being's life breath rises upward while an animal's life breath descends into the earth. So it seems to be that he does not believe in a life after death. And so for those who approach this text as Christians, we would need to think a little bit about, well, so then if we do believe in a life after death, what do we do with that? My position is always we need to let the biblical text speak for itself before we start trying to, correct it or question its assumptions. I think we should do that, but not in the first instance. So my question is, what does Kohelet teach us if we give him the possibility that death really is the end of it? Now, for Ecclesiastes, the problem is not simply that the wise and the fool die the same. The problem is also that while we are alive, the rewards and punishments that come to the wise and the foolish or the righteous and the wicked don't match up. So Proverbs has taught him that there is a relationship between act and consequence. If you're righteous, you prosper. If you're wicked, you suffer. You die young or something like that. But Ecclesiastes looks around, the gatherer looks around, and he says, I've seen everything in my vaporous life, my pointless life. The righteous person dies in spite of their righteousness. The wicked live long in spite of their wickedness. Now, you don't have to live real long to realize that this is true, that Proverbs has given us kind of a hopeful idea that your behaviors, your actions lead to predictable consequences. Ecclesiastes, in this, I think, much more realistic way, says, well, maybe sometimes that happens, but that is not always the way it happens. We can think of plenty of people who have been wonderful people who have had terrible things happen to them. We can think of people who live very unethically, who seem to prosper without any sort of punishment. He goes on in 14 to say the righteous get what the wicked deserve, the wicked get what the righteous deserve. So the reward and consequence here is exactly backwards for him. Then he goes on to say, in the place of justice, there is wickedness. In the place of what was right, there is wickedness again. So now he's thinking like everything is just all wickedness all the time. And there is no place for righteousness. So you look around, you can't even see righteousness in the world. Then he comes to this conclusion, which is one of the starkest conclusions one could come to. And this is where he ends up. I declare the dead who have already died are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. So if you're dead, you no longer have to deal with the injustice of life, right? If you're alive, you're still suffering through this world where nothing makes any sense. Then in verse 3, but happier than both are those who never existed, who haven't witnessed the terrible things that happen under the sun. So if you've got your choices, the worst choice is to be alive, the better choice is to already have died, the best choice is to never exist at all. We recognize this maybe from the book of Job in chapter 3, where Job wishes that the date he was born had never appeared on the calendar. He wants to erase his existence altogether. Now, interestingly, Kohelet, the gatherer, never thinks about taking his own life. He's sort of like, this is the fate we have. But he kind of wishes that he had not had to live that fate. He then thinks about what does this mean in terms of economics. And here I think is a pretty sharp critique of at least one version of American culture, which is grounded in this kind of like acquisitiveness, that the purpose of life is to make money, to gain. Not the only way of thinking about life in American culture, but certainly a prevalent one. The gatherer says the money lover isn't satisfied with money, neither is the lover of wealth satisfied with income. This too is pointless. When the good things flow, so do those who consume them. But what do the owners benefit from such goods except to feast their eyes on them? So here his idea is, in order to make a lot of money, you have to spend all your time thinking about how to make more money. People become obsessed with being able to make more money, and so they don't actually really enjoy the things that are before them. Maybe other people enjoy the fruits of their labor, but they themselves lie awake at night worried about their money, and then eventually the stock market crashes or a pandemic approaches and everything you've built falls apart. Now this brings us around for Kohelet to the question of God. If the world is created in this way, in which righteousness and reward are not reliably related to each other, what do we say about God who created the world? Now there might be all kinds of ways of answering that question, some of which are theologically astute and some of which are kind of cop-outs. And so I'll let you sort of think about what other possible solutions there are to this question of, if the world is crooked, what does that mean about God? What Ecclesiastes says is, I observed all the work of God, that no one can grasp what happens under the sun. There are those who strive to know, but can't grasp it. Even the wise who are set on knowing are unable to grasp it. Here his solution is the inscrutability of God. God is doing something, but we don't know what God is doing. So the problem here for Ecclesiastes is, maybe in some universe like that we don't have access to, God is rewarding certain behaviors and punishing others. But we don't understand the categories that God is working in. So when we do what we think is righteous, we still end up getting punished. And when people do things that we think are wicked, they end up getting rewarded. So God is unknowable, and therefore the rules of the game are undecidable. And so we just don't know, like, how do you live in that kind of a world? We don't know. Then he says, human beings can't contend with the one who is stronger than they. So God is inscrutable and powerful. We can't convince God to do anything other than what God is already going to do. Because who knows what's good for human beings during life, during their brief, pointless life, which will pass away like a shadow? Who can say what the future holds for people under the sun? So here Ecclesiastes is coming around to this issue that if you don't know what behaviors are good or bad, what's going to lead to righteousness or wickedness, what's going to lead to reward or punishment, what the relationship is between action and consequence. How do you live? How do you secure a future? How do you make your way forward in life? And his answer, which he gave us all the way back at the beginning, is there is no profit in life because one does not know how to reliably undertake actions that lead to desired consequences. Who can say what the future holds? Could be a stock market crash tomorrow, or that stock you invested $1 in today might become the next Apple, you know. So that is where we will leave it. I know this is a really depressing place to leave Ecclesiastes, and he is actually going to relieve our tension at least a little bit next time. But I don't want to go on to his solutions for how people live in a non-profit, ephemeral world where no one can predict the results of actions, and where even if you happen to succeed, people will forget you within a couple of generations. I don't want to take us away from that question too quickly, because it really is an important question. What does it, like, how do we live in the reality that we are mortal beings who cannot control the outcomes of our life? No matter how well we live, we might be in a car crash tomorrow, and then what would it have added up to? That's the question that he leaves us with, and that's where we'll pick up next time. If you want to know more about me or about the things that I'm up to, here's places you can find me, robertwilliamsonjr.com. I'm on Facebook, robertwilliamsonjr.author. I'm on Twitter a little bit. You can email me at robert@robertwilliamsonjr.com. And if you have not listened to the Bible Worm podcast, which I do with my good friend Dr. Amy Robertson, who is a Jewish educator in Atlanta. She and I were in graduate school together, and we love to talk about biblical texts. If you haven't checked out Bible Worm, go do that. I will see you next time for a little more Ecclesiastes. See you then.